Hello and welcome to Lost Love Chronicles. When I met Hannah, I had very little: an entry level job, some student loan debt, and a small apartment with roommates. It wasn't glamorous, but it was my life. On the other hand, her family had money, not the kind of wealth that comes with private jets every week. But they were comfortable and established. They owned property, ran a successful local business, and lived in a large house in a well off neighborhood. The contrast in our financial situations was clear from the start. I never felt out of place with Hannah, but I always knew there was a disparity in where we came from. We dated for about a year and things seemed good between us. But when we started talking about marriage, that's when the other elements began to surface. Hannah's parents, especially her father, Joseph, were very involved in her life and decisions. They weren't outright hostile, but they weren't subtle either. I remember sitting in their living room one afternoon, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air when Joseph leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table in front of him, his eyes steady but calculating. "Juan, we've been meaning to have a talk with you," he began, his voice firm but not unkind. "Hannah is our only daughter. We've worked hard to build our wealth, and we want to ensure she's taken care of. Marriage, as you know, is about merging lives and assets. We want to make sure she's financially secure." I nodded, unsure of where this conversation was going. Hannah sat beside me, her hand resting on my knee, but there was a tension in the air I hadn't expected. Joseph continued. "You're a good man. I can see that," he said, his gaze flicking briefly to Hannah before returning to me. "But we need to be practical. We can't ignore the fact that Hannah is used to a certain lifestyle. She's had security, and that's something we've worked very hard to maintain." His wife, Margaret, chimed in from the other side of the room, her voice softer but equally determined. "We're not saying you're incapable, Juan, but we've built something and we need to protect it. It's not just about today. It's about the future. Her future." There was a weight to their words that I couldn't shake off, a subtle pressure that started to settle in my chest. I'd always been honest with Hannah about where I stood financially, but hearing it from her parents directly, it felt different. "What are you suggesting?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I glanced at Hannah, but she looked down, her fingers fidgeting nervously with the hem of her sleeve. Joseph leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. "We think a prenuptial agreement is the best way to proceed. It's not personal, it's business. A way to ensure that if something were to happen, both sides are protected. It's simply a precaution." My heart sank. I had heard the term before, of course, but hearing it now in this context, it felt like a slap in the face, a prenuptial agreement. I wasn't some high-rolling entrepreneur or heir to a fortune. I was just a guy who was trying to build a life. Working my way up from the bottom, Hannah's hand tightened on mine, her thumb running over my knuckles, but she didn't speak. She didn't seem to object, or maybe she didn't know how to. I felt a rush of emotions, frustration, confusion, and yes, humiliation, all swirling together. Joseph kept talking, his tone matter-of-fact. "We've been very careful in structuring our business and assets over the years. We want to ensure that those things stay within the family, and that Hannah's inheritance remains intact. It's just a safety net, Juan. A small price to pay for peace of mind?" I sat there trying to process what they were saying. It didn't feel like a conversation about marriage. It felt like a business transaction. They weren't asking if I wanted to marry their daughter. They were telling me how it was going to happen, and it involved signing away any claim I might have to their wealth, or anything they deemed important. "I understand you want to protect her," but I trailed off, unsure how to put my thoughts into words. "What exactly are we protecting against?" Margaret's voice softened again. "You can't predict the future, Juan. Marriages change, things happen. It's just common sense to put something in place. That way, no one gets hurt if things go awry." I couldn't argue with that. My own parents had always talked about being financially cautious, about making sure you had a plan in place. But this felt like a different level. It wasn't just about protecting assets. It felt like a subtle way of saying they didn't trust me to be part of the family, in the same way they were. "What's this going to mean for me?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "What do I sign away?" Joseph smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. The lawyer we've arranged for you to meet will go over all of that with you. We wanted to be fair. You'll have the chance to consult with someone of your choosing, of course, but we recommend you move quickly. Wedding plans are already in motion, and this is a step that needs to be finalized soon. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I could hold it together much longer. I wasn't ready for this kind of pressure. Not with someone else's lawyer dictating terms and telling me what was fair. I'll take a look at the agreement, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But I can't promise anything. Joseph gave a small nod. Of course, I hope you understand why this is necessary. I sat there feeling a sense of defeat creeping in, knowing there wasn't much I could do to push back. I had no experience with legal documents like this. I couldn't afford a high-powered lawyer to negotiate terms against theirs, and I wasn't sure how far I could push without ruining things with Hannah. The agreement was straightforward in its purpose. In the event of a divorce, I wouldn't be entitled to any of Hannah's premarital assets, any inheritance she received, or any increase in value of her separate property. That part wasn't sugar-coated, and they made sure I understood it clearly. One afternoon during a follow-up with a lawyer Joseph had recommended, he slid the thick document across the table and tapped a paragraph with his pen. This clause here, he said, ensures that any increase in the value of Hannah's assets, whether from appreciation, reinvestment, or inheritance, remains hers exclusively. Even if you two were married for 20 years, that doesn't change. I nodded slowly. Okay. And what about assets we earned during the marriage? He gave a thin smile. Professional, but cool. Well, what's yours is yours, unless it's traceable to Hannah's assets. If any income or investment is linked directly or indirectly to her money, it stays hers. There are a few exceptions, but they're fairly narrow. For instance, you'd have to prove sole effort and separation of funds under very specific terms. It's all outlined here. He tapped another clause but didn't elaborate unless I asked. Reading it myself, the message was unmistakable. What was Hannah's remained Hannah's. What I earned was primarily mine and separate, and I had no claim on any marital property distribution in the traditional sense if there was any connection back to her side of the financial line. Alimony was also spelled out and not in my favor. It was either waived completely or capped at a very low amount for a short period. The language was careful phrases like temporary transitional support and minimal necessity in case of unforeseen hardship. It was designed to cover something like a brief adjustment period if Hannah ever needed it, but certainly not to support me. I sat with the document that night alone in our apartment, the city noise just a dull hum outside the window. Hannah was out with her mother looking at venues. I stared at the legal jargon and underlined sections knowing what it all meant. My financial position at the time, I had no assets to protect, nothing to bring to the table that needed shielding. The idea of accumulating significant wealth that felt like some distant reality, something that might happen someday if I got lucky, if I worked hard, if everything aligned. But in that moment, I had nothing, and that meant I had no leverage. The pressure to sign was immense. The wedding plans were already moving forward, deposits made, dates chosen, family members invited. Hannah, when I raised my concerns, gave me a tired smile, her fingers brushing my arm. I know it sucks, Juan, she said gently, but it's not about us. It's about them feeling safe. This is how they operate. It doesn't mean I don't love you. I wanted to believe her. I did, but it was clear this wasn't really up for debate. My choices were stark. Sign the agreement and marry Hannah with her family's blessing, their financial support for the wedding, and a chance at a future without constant tension or refuse, possibly end the relationship or go through with the marriage against their wishes and invite a lifetime of friction. So I signed. The prenup was duly witnessed and executed, filed away. After that, it wasn't mentioned again. Not by Joseph, not by Margaret, and not by Hannah. It became a sealed chapter tucked into a drawer and forgotten for a while. The first few years of our marriage were tight financially, just as I expected. I stayed in my entry-level job, grinding out long hours for modest paychecks. But I wasn't content to coast. I started looking for other ways to increase my income. Hannah worked part-time at first, mostly in admin roles. But after a couple of years, she shifted to managing the household full-time. She took care of things at home, which was a help, especially as my schedule started to demand more. My focus began to shift hard toward building something of my own. I knew I couldn't rely on raises or slow promotions forever. I wasn't happy with the pace of advancement in my corporate job, so I started working nights and weekends on a side project, something in the tech sector. It involved long hours, late nights, early mornings, weekends. Any spare minute I had outside my day job went into building that side project. We didn't have much disposable income, but what we did have, I funneled into the venture. Every dollar mattered. Some months we were stretched thin. Hannah managed the home during that time, and we kept things modest. Despite her family's wealth, we lived like any other middle-class couple. Small house, older cars, no fancy vacations. Her family didn't offer financial help beyond the occasional birthday check or holiday gift. There was no safety net from them, not for the business, not for us. And that business, it was mine. My risk, my long nights, my borrowed capital. I knew if it failed, the burden wouldn't fall on anyone else. I'd taken out small personal loans under my name, used credit cards carefully, found creative ways to make a little go a long way. It was a slow grind. It wasn't an overnight success story, not by any stretch. It was years of tweaking, pitching, building, breaking, fixing. I made mistakes, learned, adapted, then learned again. It took time before I saw any real traction. Eventually, the tipping point came. I was still at my full-time job when the side business started to pick up steam. Orders coming in, traffic rising, some early press. That's when I sat down with Hannah at our kitchen table one evening. "I think it's time," I said, fingers wrapped around a chipped coffee mug. "I want to leave my job, go full-time on this." She looked at me carefully. "That's a big leap." "Juan, I know it's a risk. No paycheck for a while, but I've run the numbers. If I can focus on this, we can scale. I just need the time." She was quiet, then nodded slowly. "Okay, I support it. Just promise me we'll be smart about it." Her family didn't take it as well. Joseph, in particular, made his feelings known over Sunday lunch one weekend. "You're walking away from a steady income in this economy," he said, slicing into his roast. "That seems impulsive." "It's calculated," I replied evenly. "I've run the projections. I think it's worth the risk." He gave a tight smile. "Well, it's your life." And it was. I persisted, and eventually it paid off. The business grew slowly at first. Then with momentum, I found a niche in the market. Hired smart, built a lean, focused team. We didn't just bring in revenue, we turned a profit. I reinvested nearly every cent back into the company. Those first couple of years, I was building something sustainable. By the 5-year mark in our marriage, it was no longer a side hustle. It was a real business with valuation, investor interest, and brand credibility. My equity alone represented significant wealth. In addition, I'd made a few smart moves with the profits, diversified into other investments. I kept my head down and didn't flash it around, but the numbers didn't lie. I was, by most metrics, a millionaire. It started to show in little ways. Our home got bigger. We moved into a better neighborhood, still modest compared to the gated community where Hannah grew up, but comfortable. We took a few more trips, flew business class. Hannah stopped working altogether and took over managing the household, which had grown in both size and complexity. The shift was noticeable. Her parents, who had once looked at me with thinly veiled skepticism, especially Joseph, started asking different kinds of questions. At dinner one night, he leaned forward across the table. "So, how's the company doing these days? I've been reading a lot about your sector in the papers. Interesting growth trends." It was the first time he had ever expressed genuine interest in what I did. For years it had been polite nods, maybe a dismissive comment about startup types. But now he wanted to talk about the business and its performance. Their attitude toward me shifted in a way I couldn't ignore. The man who was broke when he married their daughter was now undeniably a wealthy man. Suddenly, I wasn't just the outsider who'd lucked into their world. I was someone they began including in conversations about markets, tax strategy, portfolio diversification. "I've been thinking of rebalancing some of our assets," Joseph said to me one evening over drinks at their house, casually swirling his scotch. "You've got a good eye. Where would you put capital right now?" It was surreal. The same man who had once barely concealed his contempt for my financial standing now asked my opinion on wealth preservation. They praised my business instincts. Margaret, Hannah's mother, even told Hannah at one point, loud enough for me to overhear, "He's really made something of himself, hasn't he?" And yet, through all of that validation, the prenuptial agreement they once insisted upon, the legal safeguard to protect Hannah from my presumed failures remained a silent fixture. Never mentioned, never questioned. It just sat there, a dusty insurance policy they likely thought would never need to be cashed in. But while my professional life flourished, our marriage began to fray. My focus stayed on the business. That hadn't changed. I was constantly working, networking, strategizing, expanding. I lived in that world. Meanwhile, Hannah increasingly lived in another. She enjoyed the wealth. Yes, she was the one who suggested the move to the larger house, who arranged the redesign of the kitchen and selected the custom fixtures. She embraced the new lifestyle, and yet somehow we were moving further apart with every improvement. She developed her own social world. Gala committees, charitable boards, garden parties. Her conversations became laced with names I didn't recognize, events I hadn't been invited to. Her interests orbited around maintaining our household image, the kind of life we projected, while mine remained tied to innovation, efficiency, growth. Our communication grew cold, transactional. "Did you confirm with the caterer? Can you sign this for the gardener's invoice? Don't forget the benefit on Thursday. I can't recall the last time we sat down and spoke about dreams or goals or anything that didn't involve logistics or scheduling." The affection faded gradually, so slowly it almost felt like a natural consequence of adulthood. But it wasn't. Not entirely. Around our 10th anniversary, things changed more starkly. Hannah became distant. She was always on her phone, tilting the screen away if I walked by. She'd step outside to take certain calls. Her availability, once predictable, suddenly wasn't. Nights when she was usually home, she'd be out with the girls or at a planning meeting. I tried to bring it up a few times. "Is everything all right?" I asked one evening. "You seem distracted lately." She didn't look up from her tablet. "I'm just busy." "Juan, everything's fine." "Busy with what exactly?" "You're gone a lot." Her eyes snapped up. "Are you seriously interrogating me right now?" "I have a life too. You know, not everything revolves around your company." That was the tone for a while. Defensiveness, irritation, and underlying tension. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, slow, but unmistakable. Eventually, the truth came out. Not through her confession, but through whispers that reached me sideways. A mutual acquaintance, a loose-lipped comment at a party, a confirmation I didn't want, but couldn't ignore. Hannah was having an affair. The man, wealthy, polished, old money, fit neatly into the world she now inhabited. He wasn't part of my world. He was part of hers. He had the pedigree, the clubs, the effortless confidence of someone born into privilege. And apparently the affair had been going on for quite some time. When I confronted her, she didn't deny it. "It's not what you think," she said, as if that made a difference. "What is it then?" I asked, standing in our oversized kitchen, surrounded by polished stone and silence. "Because it looks a lot like betrayal." She didn't answer. The fallout was quick. Word reached her parents, perhaps through Hannah, perhaps through their friends. And just like that, the warmth that had developed between us froze again. Joseph called me. "We need to talk," he said curtly. "It's about Hannah and what happens next." It wasn't about regret or reconciliation, it was about money. Their focus snapped back to protecting their daughter's financial interest. Not from poverty, but from me. The same man they'd once feared couldn't provide was now someone they feared might take too much. The prenup, once a precautionary tool, was now the centerpiece of every whispered strategy, every discussion they had about Hannah's future. They were preparing for what they now saw as inevitable, the context of a likely divorce. The man Hannah had become involved with, from what I was able to gather, wasn't exactly a viable future partner. He was married. His primary residence was in another state. This wasn't some romantic entanglement destined to evolve into a second marriage. It was an affair, plain and simple, and it had clear limits. That reality likely contributed to her family's growing alarm. If my marriage to Hannah ended, She wasn't stepping into a new life of stability. She'd be left exposed. Their response was anything but subtle. Hannah's father, Joseph, called me directly. "We need to talk," he said, his tone clipped. "It's urgent about the family's well-being." I knew what that meant. I agreed to meet with him and Margaret at their house. It was an old colonial, immaculately maintained with a formality that mirrored the people who lived in it. The mood when I arrived was brittle. We sat in the sitting room, a place I'd once avoided because I always felt like I didn't belong there. Hannah was there too, quiet in the corner, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the middle distance. Joseph began with a kind of forced diplomacy. "We're aware things between you and Hannah haven't been ideal lately," he said, leaning forward in his chair, fingers laced. "We know about the man she's been seeing." Margaret glanced away as he said it, but neither of them seemed particularly interested in dwelling on the details of the affair. "Our concern," Joseph continued, "is for both of you, but especially for Hannah." I nodded once. "I see." He cleared his throat and shifted his tone. "More direct now? When we insisted on the prenuptial agreement years ago, it was because we didn't know what your future held. You were ambitious, yes, but not established. Hannah was giving up a certain level of security by marrying you. We were protecting her." I said nothing, let him keep talking. "But now," he said, spreading his hands, "the situation is reversed. You've built something significant. You're no longer the man who needed that document to prove his intentions." He paused there, watching me like he expected some kind of agreement. I kept my expression neutral. "The original premise of that prenup," he went on, "was based on inequality that no longer exists. In fact, you far surpassed any expectations we could have had, which is why we think it's time to reevaluate." "Reevaluate?" I asked. Joseph leaned back slightly, measured. "We're proposing that you and Hannah mutually agree to terminate the prenuptial agreement. Tear it up, so to speak. Replace it if you want with something more equitable, or just let the standard state divorce process handle the division of assets." Margaret finally spoke then, softly. "It's about fairness, Juan. You've done well, and Hannah has supported you. She ran the house, maintained your lives while you focused on the business." I looked at Hannah. She didn't meet my eyes. "I see." I said, "So now that there's something to take, the prenup is unfair." Joseph bristled but kept his tone even. "We're asking you to consider what's right. She's been your wife for over a decade. This isn't about punishing anyone, it's about acknowledging what's changed." I didn't respond right away. My hands were folded in my lap. I could feel my pulse in my thumbs. There was no mention of the affair, no acknowledgement that her choices might have changed the moral equation. The focus was singular, my wealth, and how much of it Hannah was now entitled to. Hannah sat silently through the exchange. No defense, no apology, no anger, just a quiet presence, detached from the discussion about her future. She didn't say much. Hannah mostly let her parents speak for her during the meeting. When she was prompted, she finally said, "I just think the agreement doesn't reflect where we are now." It made sense then, but everything's changed. She didn't express any remorse about the affair. No apology, no regret, no real concern for the state of our marriage. Her focus was singular and calculated. She believed she was entitled to a portion of the assets I had built over the years. That was the word she used, entitled. It was clear what this was. She wanted out. Maybe not to run off with the man she'd been seeing, though I suspected that was the underlying motivation, but certainly to be free to pursue that relationship, or whatever came next, and to take a substantial financial settlement with her. That was their plan. I listened to everything they had to say. I let them make their arguments uninterrupted. When they finally finished, I kept my voice calm. "I understand your position," I said, "but let me be equally clear about mine." I looked directly at Joseph and then at Margaret, then finally at Hannah, who still couldn't bring herself to meet my eyes. The prenuptial agreement is a legally binding contract. It was drafted by attorneys, reviewed by independent counsel, yours as well as mine, and signed by both Hannah and me with full knowledge of its terms and implications. At the time, it was made crystal clear what the agreement covered, including assets acquired in the future. Joseph opened his mouth to interject, but I held up a hand. You insisted on that agreement, I continued. You pushed for it. You wanted to protect Hannah from marrying someone who didn't have money, from any claim I might ever have on your wealth or her premarital assets. That's what the agreement was for. I leaned forward slightly, meeting Joseph's sighs. And the irony here is that the very scenario it was designed to cover, one party becoming significantly more successful during the marriage, has happened. The agreement was written with that in mind. It wasn't nullified by my success. It was built for it. No one spoke. I upheld my end of the marriage. I said, I worked. I built something. I provided. And I did it without touching a cent of Hannah's premarital assets or relying on anything from your family. I've honored the terms of our marriage, and I expect the legal agreement we signed to be honored as well. I turned slightly to address all three of them. I will not agree to tear up the prenup. I will not sign a new one. I will not entertain a settlement outside of its terms. Any divorce will proceed under the existing prenuptial agreement in full force and effect. For a moment, the room was still. Then I saw the shift, the disbelief on Hannah's face, the sharp tension in Joseph's jaw. They hadn't expected this. They thought I'd cave, that I'd feel guilt or obligation or fear, that I'd roll over to avoid a fight. Maybe they thought some old-fashioned notion of chivalry would compel me to be fair, now that there was money on the table. Joseph's tone changed. His voice grew colder. You realize this won't be easy, he said. We'll contest it in court. That means legal fees, time, public records. Do you want your business dragged into something messy like that? Do you want your name out there? I didn't flinch. I've already retained legal counsel, I said, an attorney who specializes in defending prenuptial agreements. I'm prepared for exactly that. Joseph narrowed his eyes. You think you'll win? I stood up. I know I will, I said. I know the agreement is enforceable and I'm ready to defend it. I turned toward the door, then looked back at them all, Joseph, Margaret, and Hannah. This meeting, I said, is over, and I left their house. Following that meeting at her parents' house, everything went downhill fast. Hannah initiated divorce proceedings almost immediately. I wasn't surprised, not after what I'd heard, but what did surprise me was the aggressive posture her legal team took from the start. Her lawyer, no doubt handpicked and funded by her parents, made their intentions clear early. They were going to challenge the validity of the prenuptial agreement. They didn't even pretend otherwise. The arguments they raised were predictable echoes of her father's thinly veiled threats during our last meeting. According to them, the agreement was now unconscionable because of how drastically my financial situation had changed. They also tried to paint a narrative that I had coerced Hannah into signing it, despite the fact that not only had she been represented by counsel, but it had been her family's idea in the first place, and it was their recommended attorney who reviewed it on her behalf. It was a difficult claim to swallow, even in the abstract. Still, they pushed forward with it. Their position, absurdly, was that the prenup should be dismissed entirely, that Hannah was now entitled to significant alimony and a substantial cut of my assets, as if the agreement had never existed. My legal team was ready. I had chosen them carefully, anticipating exactly this kind of escalation. We filed our response, and we didn't flinch. From the very first reply, we asserted the absolute validity of the prenuptial agreement. We submitted everything. The original signed contract, proof that Hannah had independent legal counsel, financial disclosures from the time of signing, and even emails and statements from her parents, her own parents, indicating that it was they who had insisted on the agreement in the first place. We made our position clear. The change in my financial situation wasn't some unforeseen development that invalidated the prenup. It was exactly the sort of situation the agreement had been crafted to address. The entire point of a prenuptial contract is to allocate expectations and risks when it comes to future earnings, future assets, and how those would or would not be shared in the event of divorce. We emphasized that Hannah had entered into the agreement fully informed and voluntarily. There had been no deception, no hidden clauses, no rushed signature. Everything had been disclosed, reviewed, and signed with the full understanding of what it meant. As for the divorce itself, we included just enough factual detail to present context. Nothing vindictive, nothing salacious, but we did note that the breakdown of the marriage occurred amidst her affair and that it happened at the precise time she was maneuvering for a financial position, contrary to the very contract she had agreed to. We didn't bring up fault in the traditional sense. Depending on the state, that doesn't always carry weight in court, but the timing and circumstances mattered in illustrating intent. What followed was a slow grind. Months of legal filings, motions, and court-mandated mediation attempts that went nowhere. Henna aside, still under her parents' influence, flatly refused to acknowledge the binding nature of the prenup. It was infuriating, but I kept my composure and let my lawyers do their work, and they did methodically, ruthlessly even. They dismantled every claim Hannah's team put forward. They demonstrated that she had independent legal counsel at the time of signing, that both our financial situations had been accurately disclosed, that the contract explicitly outlined how future assets would be treated, and that Hannah had not contributed financially or professionally to the assets I had built during the marriage. They claimed that the agreement was unconscionable due to a change in circumstances. Legally, it was a stretch. Courts rarely throw out prenups just because one person became wealthy, especially when that wealth was earned independently. The legal standard for unconscionability is extremely high. It generally applies only when the agreement is so lopsided that it leaves one party destitute or unable to meet basic living needs. And that was not the case here. Given Hannah's family's resources and how long they were willing to drag things out, it wasn't surprising when the court eventually scheduled formal hearings specifically to address the validity of the prenuptial agreement. This would be settled as a preliminary matter, before any discussions of alimony or asset division could even begin. In many ways, this was the fight. If the prenup held, everything else fell into place. If it didn't, then everything I had built would be up for grabs. As the hearings unfolded, it quickly became clear that Hannah's case was thin. Her team leaned hard on emotional rhetoric and vague accusations of coercion and unfairness, but these just didn't hold up under scrutiny. Her own past statements came back to bite them, especially emails and texts between her and her parents from years ago. They made it clear the prenuptial agreement had been their idea, and she had been fully on board. In one email, her father had written, "It's just smart to protect yourself. Juan will understand. It's just business." Another from Hannah to her mother read, "Dad says the lawyer he knows is good and fast. I'll get it signed before we pick a venue." So much for coercion. My legal team presented everything cleanly and without drama. They walked the court through the timeline, how the agreement was proposed, how both of us had legal counsel or the opportunity to retain it, how we had made full disclosures of our financial situations at the time, and how the contract explicitly addressed future assets. It was clear, organized, and deeply persuasive. And when it became obvious to Hannah's team that they were headed for a loss, they started to shift tactics. Not a full retreat, no offer to settle according to the prenup. But suddenly they were talking about fairness and narrow exceptions. It was a soft pivot, a backup plan. But my lawyers saw through it. "Stay firm," my lead attorney told me. "The prenup is your shield. It's already done its job. Don't let them convince you to give that up now." And he was right. When the judge finally ruled, the decision was not only in my favor, it was unequivocal. The court found the prenuptial agreement was validly executed. Both parties had the opportunity for legal representation. There had been full and fair disclosure of assets at the time it was signed. And most importantly, the judge ruled that the terms were not unconscionable when the agreement was made. One line from the ruling stood out to me, something I'd remember for a long time. The judge stated, "The subsequent accumulation of wealth by one party, particularly when explicitly contemplated by the agreement's provisions regarding future assets, does not render the agreement unconscionable or invalid." That sentence shut the door on any further challenge. The agreement stood years later,